Today's video is sponsored by Brilliant, and it's going to help make you, well, brilliant, isn't it? Some truth in advertising for a change. Brilliant, for those who don't already know, is a website and app built on the idea of active problem solving, because it takes more to learn something than just watching it or reading it to really learn something. You have to do it, which is why Brilliant has tons of lessons on its platform for lifelong learners who aren't content to just coast through adulthood with the skills that they learned in school. For example, have you ever wanted to learn how computer programming works but were put off or intimidated by opaque coding language? It's all very confusing. Well, Brilliant can help you learn how to program without having to dig deep through the weeds of coding syntax thanks to fun, interactive challenges. Brilliant users can shift around blocks of pseudocode, then get immediate feedback on their results. It's an engaging way to understand how computer algorithms work, and once you've got that down, the coding syntax becomes a lot less intimidating. On Brilliant, it's not about memorizing or regurgitating facts for a test. You can just pick a course you're interested in and get started. Feeling stuck, afraid you made a mistake? That's never an issue here. You can read the explanations to find out more and learn at your own pace. So if you're a lifelong learner who wants to give Brilliant a try, you guys can get a free trial plus 20% off the cost of a year's subscription by going to brilliant.org/brainfood, or just follow the link in the description box below. That deal is only for the first 200 people who click, by the way. So go on, be quick, head over there. And now today's video. On April 6, 1945, Imperial Japan launched Operation Tengo, a desperate last-ditch naval attack against the Allied fleet supporting the invasion of Okinawa. Supported by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, the charge was led by the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the mighty battleship Yamato. A quarter-kilometer long, displacing 650,000 tons and armed with no fewer than 9 46-centimeter guns firing 1.5-ton shells, Yamato was the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, and considered by Japanese high command to be a nigh unstoppable weapon. But the glorious last ride of the Imperial Navy was not to be. Before the task force could even reach Okinawa, it was set upon by over 400 warplanes launched from American aircraft carriers. Less than 5 hours after first contact, Yahagi, 4 destroyers, and even the mighty Yamato had been sent to the bottom. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors died in the engagement for the loss of only 12 US airmen. It was Japan's last major naval operation of the war and marked the end of an era. The battleship, once the last word in naval firepower, no longer ruled the seas. In retrospect, the Japanese should have seen this coming, for they themselves had taught the British Royal Navy the same lesson nearly 4 years before. This is the tragic story of the sinking of Force Z. After the First World War, the British Empire reached its greatest extent, encompassing more than 26% of the world's land area and 23% of its population. However, by the 1930s, what had long been Britain's greatest strength was fast becoming its greatest liability. The Empire's far-flung colonies could only be protected and held together by the Royal Navy, and with post-war budget cuts and the onset of the Great Depression, even this mighty force found itself stretched dangerously thin. This made Britain's overseas territories tempting targets for other up-and-coming imperial powers, including the Empire of Japan. Following their stunning victory over the Russian Empire in the 1904 to 1905 Russia-Japanese War, the Japanese had come to see themselves as the natural masters of Asia and had pursued a policy of aggressive territorial expansion known euphemistically as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In 1910, Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula, while in 1931, Japanese troops annexed the Chinese province of Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. This was followed by a full-scale invasion of southern China in July 1937, while in September 1940, the Japanese captured the French colony of Indochina, today Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The latter development particularly rattled the British, for it placed Japanese forces within easy striking distance of Hong Kong, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, colonies rich in the rubber, tin, and oil the Japanese needed to feed their imperial war machine. Anticipating such an invasion, in 1919, the British had established a large naval base at Singapore and developed the so-called Singapore Strategy to deter Japanese aggression. This strategy, developed from a series of war plans over 20 years, was to be carried out in 3 phases. At the onset of a Japanese attack, the British garrison would man and defend Fortress Singapore, holding out while the British home fleet sailed for the Far East via the Mediterranean Suez Canal and Ceylon, today Sri Lanka. On arrival, the fleet would retake Hong Kong and relieve Singapore before sailing on to blockade the Japanese home islands. Since the Royal Navy was still the most powerful naval force in the world, the British were confident the Japanese would not risk a direct confrontation and would quickly capitulate. The Singapore strategy became the cornerstone of British defence strategy in the Far East. Its effectiveness considered so assured, as Royal Navy Captain Stephen Roscoe wrote in 1937, quote, "The concept of the main fleet to Singapore had perhaps, through constant repetition, assumed something of the inviolability of Holy Writ." But while the Singapore strategy was impressive on paper, a combination of poor planning, budgetary limitations, political interference, and plain hubris led the British to make a series of major strategic blunders. For example, planners believed that the monsoon season would prevent Japanese forces from crossing the Gulf of Thailand from Indochina to Malaya until at least February 1942. Consequently, most of the aircraft defending the peninsula were diverted for service in the Middle East and Russia. Racist attitudes towards the Japanese also led the British to underestimate the capability of their armed forces, leaving Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya poorly garrisoned. As we shall see, this was to have disastrous consequences for the British Empire in the Far East. There was also another major complicating factor: Nazi Germany. On September 3rd, 1939, the same day Britain declared war on Germany, the German Navy launched a campaign of unrestricted submarine and surface warfare against British and Allied merchant shipping, hoping to starve the island nation into submission. Suddenly, nearly the entire Royal Navy was called upon to counter the Nazi threat, leaving few ships available to defend the Far East. In desperation, Britain called upon the US Navy to contribute ships from its Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, but the United States, which was still officially neutral in the conflict, was hesitant to deploy its ships in defense of British colonial interests and decided instead to focus its efforts on the Atlantic theater once it entered the war. The British therefore developed a strategy of replacement, whereby American ships deployed into the Atlantic would free up British ships for deployment to the Far East. The full build-up of this Eastern Squadron was to be completed within 80 days after the entry of Japan and the United States into the war, which was anticipated to occur sometime in late 1941 or early 1942. Thankfully, US President Franklin Roosevelt chose not to wait until the United States had officially entered the war to intervene in the Atlantic, meaning that by August 1941 there was sufficient US naval presence in the Atlantic for an Eastern Squadron to be deployed ahead of the anticipated Japanese invasion. The question now became which ships to send. While Prime Minister Winston Churchill favoured sending the most advanced King George V battleships, First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pounds and Admiral of the Home Fleet Sir John Tovey disagreed, arguing that the class's design made it unsuitable for operations in tropical climates. They also wished to keep the more powerful vessels in home waters to counter the German warships to Pitts, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau. In the end, however, circumstances decided the matter, for there were only 6 capital ships in a fit enough state to reach the Far East before the spring of 1942. The King George V class battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the renowned class battlecruiser HMS Repulse, and the 4 Revenge class battleships HMS Revenge, Resolution, Royal Sovereign, and Ramillies. HMS Prince of Wales was the Royal Navy's newest and most advanced battleship. Launched in May 1939, she was still being fitted out when, on May the 24th, 1940, she was called out to face the German battleship Bismarck. With workmen from the Vickers engineering firm still aboard, scrambling to get her radar and gun-laying systems online, she steamed into the Battle of Denmark Strait, receiving 7 direct hits, including a 15 shell that ricocheted through her compass platform, killing everyone except the captain and a signalman. But she gave as good as she got, and managed to land 2 crippling hits that contributed to the Bismarck's eventual destruction 3 days later. After being repaired in August of 1940, Prince of Wales carried Prime Minister Winston Churchill across the Atlantic to a secret conference with President Roosevelt. Then, in September, it was assigned to Force H, escorting supply convoys to the Mediterranean island of Malta. HMS Repulse, on the other hand, was a much older ship, launched in January 1916. She participated in the 1917 Battle of Heligoland Bight, only action of the First World War, and in the 1930s escorted merchant ships during the Spanish Civil War. Due to lessons learned during the war, her armour and guns were upgraded in 1918 and again in 1934 and 1940. She was scheduled to receive a further upgrade to her anti-aircraft batteries, but her assignment to the Far East Task Force resulted in this plan being abandoned, leaving Repulse vulnerable to air attack. The Revenge-class battleships were even older, having been launched between 1913 and 1914. Considered obsolete and no match for the latest Imperial Japanese Navy vessels, the battleships were instead assigned to the 3rd Battle Squadron based in Ceylon, arriving in September 1941. Meanwhile, Prince of Wales, Repulse, and the escorting destroyers HMS Electra, Express, and Hesperus were organized into Force G under the command of Admiral Sir Thomas Phillips. Prime Minister Churchill and his naval advisors continued to argue over the composition of the squadrons, so in the end, a compromise solution was reached. Force G was ordered to sail for Cape Town, South Africa, where it would anchor and await instructions. The Admiralty would then review the strategic situation and decide whether to send the ships on to Singapore or retain them for use in home waters. Repulse, which had just finished escorting a supply convoy around the Cape of Good Hope, was ordered to Ceylon to rendezvous with the rest of the force. While Churchill had recommended the force be escorted by aircraft carrier, the only available ship, HMS Indomitable, had run aground in Jamaica and would not be ready to sail until November. So, with time of the essence, Force G set off for Singapore without air cover, sailing from Greenock in Scotland on October the 25th, 1941. Though a far cry from the massive fleet called for by the original Singapore strategy, Churchill was confident that the, quote, smallest number of the best ships would be more than enough to deter the Japanese. Force G arrived in Cape Town on November the 16th. Admiral Phillips expected to remain in South Africa for at least 7 days, a week of social events and media coverage having been planned for propaganda and morale-boosting purposes. But before the Prince of Wales even reached Cape Town, Phillips received orders to depart as soon as possible and rendezvous with Repulse in Ceylon. The anticipated review of Force G's mission was, in fact, a ruse meant to deceive Winston Churchill. The Admiralty had already committed to carrying out the Singapore strategy in full. Meanwhile, Repulse was in Durban, South Africa, preparing to sail to Ceylon. There, her crew received a disturbing portent of things to come as South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts came abroad and delivered an address. While no official record of this speech survives, able seaman Ted Matthews later recalled the sobering tone, quote, "From the outset, he shattered our conceptions of the Japanese military, stating in clear terms that if hostilities erupted, we weren't going to be confronted by a race of inferiors. To the contrary, he felt that the Japs weren't in the least concerned with the possibility of conflict with Britain. He also made it clear, despite what we'd been told in the past, that they possessed a fully modern air force." Though the one comment that's never left me were the fatalistic words he feared many of us wouldn't be returning from this mission and to pray for our safety during the troubled times ahead. None of us could possibly have imagined the accuracy of this prophecy. Prince of Wales and her escorts remained in Cape Town for only 2 days, departing on the afternoon of November the 18th. On November the 29th, Force G reached Ceylon, where it was joined by Repulse and the destroyers HMS Encounter and HMS Jupiter. Hesperus had already departed before the force reached Cape Town. Admiral Phillips disembarked and flew on to Singapore and the Philippines to meet with Allied commanders, while the fleet sailed on without him, finally reaching Singapore on December the 2nd. On arrival, the destroyers Encounter and Jupiter were found to be suffering from mechanical faults and were replaced by the First World War vintage destroyers HMAS Vampire and HMS Tenedos. Prince of Wales then entered the dry dock at Singapore Naval Base and underwent a thorough cleaning of her hull and boilers. Then, less than a week later, the long-expected attack finally came. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, was merely the opening move in a massive, coordinated series of invasions all across Southeast Asia. Indeed, even before the Imperial Navy's aircraft had even reached Hawaii, Japanese troops landed in Malaya, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. As these locations were across the international dateline from Hawaii, the attacks were recorded as taking place on December the 8th. That same day, Japanese aircraft based in Indochina bombed Singapore. Force G, now designated Force Z, fired at the attacking aircraft while sitting at anchor, but made and received no hits. Once news of the attack reached Britain, Admiral Phillips was ordered to weigh anchor and intercept Japanese invasion convoys steaming across the Gulf of Thailand. Phillips hesitated, for the only Allied aircraft available to protect the fleet were the 10 slow and outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters of No. 453 Squadron RAAF stationed at Semboang. Admiral Tovey's misgivings about the ship had also proven correct. The hot, humid climate of Singapore had rendered the Prince of Wales's gun control radars inoperative and degraded her anti-aircraft ammunition, while the ship's lack of air conditioning had led to increased crew fatigue. Nonetheless, Phillips elected to proceed, believing that Japanese aircraft could not operate so far from land, and the Prince of Wales was all but impervious to aerial attack. After all, at that point, no capital ship had ever been sunk by aircraft on the open sea. It was a gamble which was going to cost him dearly. Force Z departed Singapore at 1700 hours on December the 8th and sailed north to intercept Japanese forces, landing at Kota Bharu on the northeast coast of Malaya. The following day, at around 1400 hours, they were spotted by the Japanese submarine I-65, which shadowed the squadron for 5 hours, reporting their positions. This report soon reached the headquarters of the Japanese Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla, which had just arrived at airfields in Indochina. At the time, 22nd's aircraft were loading up with bombs for an attack on Singapore, but upon receiving news of Force Z's sailing, they immediately switched over to torpedoes. However, by the time the aircraft were ready, the sun was beginning to set, and the attack was postponed until the following morning. Meanwhile, the Japanese Second Fleet was dispatched south from Indochina to intercept Force Z. While the two fleets never spotted each other, just before sunset, Force Z was spotted by 3 seaplanes launched by Japanese convoy escorts. Realizing it lost the element of surprise, Phillips abandoned his attack on Kota Bharu and turned back towards Singapore. Just before 100 hours the following morning, Phillips received a radio message indicating that Japanese troops were landing at Kuantan on the east coast of Malaya. At around 700 hours, Force Z reached the area and Prince of Wales launched a reconnaissance aircraft to investigate. When neither it nor the Destroyer Express found anything, Phillips carried on towards Singapore. Little did he know, however, that he'd been spotted by the submarine I-58 and that 34 Mitsubishi G3M Nell torpedo bombers and 51 G4M Betty high-level bombers of the 22nd Air Flotilla were on their way to intercept him. The first ship the bombers spotted was not, however, the Prince of Wales or the Repulse, but the destroyer Tenedos, which had sailed for Singapore the day before to refuel and was now 300 kilometers south of Force Z. Mistaking the destroyer for a battleship, at 1000 hours, the aircraft dropped several armor-piercing bombs on the ship before realizing their mistake and breaking off. Minutes later, a Japanese scout aircraft spotted Force Z and called in the rest of the bomber force on its position. The attack had begun. The first wave of 8 bombers attacked at around 11:15, focusing exclusively on Repulse. The old battlecruiser proved surprisingly nimble, however, and managed to dodge most of their bombs, suffering only 1 minor hit to her seaplane hangar. In return, her anti-aircraft gunners damaged 5 of the attacking craft. The next wave arrived at 11:40, dropping 8 torpedoes at the 2 ships. Only 1 struck home, hitting Prince of Wales's outer port propeller shaft. The shaft, rotating at full speed, twisted and ripped through the bulkhead, sending 2,400 tons of water pouring into the ship's engineering compartments. The explosion set off a chain of failures, jamming the ship's steering, shorting out her electrical generators, knocking out her bilge pumps, and preventing her electrically driven anti-aircraft guns from being trained. Fatally crippled, Prince of Wales steamed helplessly northwards and was struck by 4 more torpedoes and 1 bomb. At 1300 hours, Phillips gave the order to abandon ship. Meanwhile, Repulse fought on, successfully dodging 19 torpedoes and shooting down 3 aircraft. At 12:23, however, she too was struck by 4 torpedoes. The ship listed 65 degrees to port, hung on for several moments, then rolled over and sank. Less than an hour later, at 13:18, Prince of Wales, pride of the Royal Navy, also capsized and slipped beneath the waves. From start to finish, the attack had taken little more than 2 hours. Electra, Vampire, and Express moved in to rescue the survivors. In all, 840 British sailors lost their lives that day, 327 aboard the Prince of Wales and 513 aboard Repulse, which had capsized before the order to abandon ship could be given. Of the senior officers, Admiral Phillips and Captain John Leach of the Prince of Wales chose to go down with their ship, while Captain William Tennant of the Repulse was among the survivors. Ironically, while it was Admiral Phillips's brash decision to sail from Singapore which placed Force Z in the path of the Japanese bombers, it was his caution which sealed the squadron's fate, for throughout the operation, Phillips maintained complete radio silence so as not to give up his position. Indeed, it was not until an hour into the Japanese attack that the first radio signal was sent calling for air support. By this time, however, it was far too late. The aircraft of No. 453 Squadron arriving on the scene just as the Prince of Wales went under. As the squadron's commander, Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers, later lamented, "I reckon this must have been the last battle in which the Navy reckons they could get along without the RAF. A pretty damned costly way of learning." Phillips had known that he was being shadowed that night before, and also at dawn that day. He did not call for air support. He was attacked, and still did not call for help. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Churchill was woken in the middle of the night by news of the sinking, later writing, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Across this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked." But the worst was yet to come. Hong Kong fell on December the 25th after 17 days of fighting. In Malaya, invading Japanese troops moved with terrifying speed, aided by excellent British-built roads, the inexperience and disorganization of the defending garrison, and a deceptively simple piece of technology, the bicycle. And for more on that, please do check out our previous video, How Bicycles Caused the Downfall of the British Empire. By January the 31st, 1942, the defending Commonwealth troops had been pushed off the peninsula and retreated to the island of Singapore, blowing up the Johor Causeway behind them. The 85,000-strong garrison fought on for another 2 weeks, finally surrendering on February the 15th. Some 140,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian troops marched into Japanese captivity, the single greatest defeat in British military history. Within months, the Japanese Empire controlled a huge swath of Asia and the Pacific, stretching from northern Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. It would not be until the Battle of Midway in June 1942 that the tide finally turned, and the Allies began the long, bloody island-hopping campaign that would take them from the island of Guadalcanal to Japan's very doorstep. By that time, however, the Allies had learned the hard lesson taught to them by the tragic loss of Repulse and the Prince of Wales. Never again would an Allied capital ship operate without a protective screen of aircraft. For as the sinking of the Yamato proved beyond a doubt, the age of the battleship was over. The seas now belonged to the aeroplane.